The chime above the door rang faintly as Elliot Reese stepped into Harbor and Hearth, the kind of modest diner that smelled like stories and second chances. Fresh bread, brewing coffee, and the faint citrus of lemon cleaner on the old wooden floors. He didn't belong here, not really. Elliot's world had been carved from glass and steel, high-rise boardrooms, and measured conversations. But tonight, it wasn't about suits or shareholders. Tonight was about something more fragile. Something he didn't know how to fix. His daughter Sophie sat in a wheelchair beside him, small, silent, wrapped in a pale blue coat with a collar she kept fiddling with. Her head leaned slightly to one side. Her fingers twitched at the hem of her dress, but she never looked up. She hadn't spoken in 3 years. The hostess, a young woman with weary eyes and a name tag that said Megan, gave a thin smile. "Table for 2. "Somewhere quiet," Elliot replied, his voice as flat and controlled as the markets he once dominated. Megan nodded and led them to a booth tucked away in the back near the window, far from the low hum of local chatter. The booth's red vinyl seats cracked softly beneath them. Elliot slid in across from his daughter. He reached for a menu but barely glanced at it. "Sophie," he said gently, "are you hungry, sweetheart?" She didn't blink, didn't move. He exhaled, slow, heavy. Once he could command a room with a whisper. Now he couldn't reach his own daughter. A waitress approached. Late 20s, flower on her apron, soft curls escaping from her ponytail. There was something in her eyes, warmth untouched by the exhaustion she clearly carried. "Hi there," she said. "I'm Clara. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Elliot looked up. "Grilled chicken for me, something soft for my daughter." "Maybe soup." Clara crouched slightly to meet Sophie's level, her brow creased with gentle concern. "Would she like chicken noodle? Ours is homemade." He hesitated, then nodded. "That's fine. Coming right up." As she walked away, Elliot pulled out his phone muscle memory but found himself scrolling without reading. His mind was elsewhere. Would Sophie eat tonight? Would she push away the spoon again? A few minutes later, Clara returned. She placed the bowl carefully in front of Sophie and the plate before Elliot. "Let me know if you need anything," she said with a smile, then moved to another table. Elliot picked up the spoon. "All right, sweetheart, let's try." He dipped into the soup, brought the spoon toward her lips. Clang, Sophie's hand snapped up, knocking the spoon from his grip. Broth splattered across the table. A few customers glanced over. Elliot clenched his jaw, not at her, never at her, at himself. He reached for the spoon again, slower this time. "Sophie, please." Nothing, she stared at the table, as still and distant as always. He rubbed his face. For all the fortune he'd amassed, nothing humbled him more than these moments, these quiet heartbreaks. Then a voice behind him. "May I?" Clara, she was kneeling now beside Sophie, eyes not pleading, not pitiful, just present. "What?" Elliot asked, confused. "May I try?" she repeated, nodding toward the spoon. He froze. He had paid for the best therapists, specialists, behaviorists. None of them had gotten through. This was a waitress in a small-town diner. Still, something in her voice, gentle, sure, not forced. He handed her the spoon. Clara didn't rush, she didn't even move the spoon at first. Instead, she said softly, "Hi, Sophie." Her tone was light, warm, as if she were greeting an old friend, not a silent child she'd just met. Sophie didn't respond. "That soup," Clara said, dipping into the bowl. "My mom used to say it was like a hug from the inside. Would you like to try a little hug?" She lifted the spoon just a little, not demanding, not urgent. Elliot watched, breath held. Sophie's fingers twitched just slightly. Clara smiled. "Just a taste, okay." She inched the spoon closer. Sophie didn't flinch this time, and then a sip. Sophie swallowed. It was one motion, one simple swallow. But for a child who hadn't eaten willingly in months, it was monumental, then something else. Sophie looked up, not past Clara. Not through her, at her, and then she smiled. Elliot's chest tightened so fast he nearly gasped. She hadn't smiled in years, not since her mother died. Everything around them blurred, the booths, the customers, the sounds of clinking dishes. All he saw was his daughter smiling, and the woman who'd made it happen. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Clara looked up, her hazel eyes soft. "I just talked to her." Like it was the simplest thing in the world. But for Elliot, it changed everything. That night, long after he'd tucked Sophie into bed, Elliot sat alone in his study. Whiskey in hand, city lights dim through rain-slicked windows. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara. About the moment Sophie smiled. About how someone had reached her when no one else could. He picked up his phone. Find everything you can about a woman named Clara Monroe, he told his assistant. The next evening he returned to the diner. Less crowded, the air smelled of pie and pine cleaner. Clara was wiping down a table, a smear of flour on her cheek. She looked up as he approached. Mr. Reese. We need to talk, he said. I'm working. This won't take long. She sighed but motioned for him to follow her to the back corridor. Elliot didn't waste time. You were incredible with Sophie. Clara blinked. I just treated her like a kid. Not a diagnosis. He studied her. You've worked with children like her before. I used to babysit. You're lying. Her jaw tightened. I did some digging, Elliot said. NYU, top of your class, special education major, then nothing. You dropped out, no record, now you're here waiting tables. Clara's fists clenched. That's none of your business. It is, he said calmly, if you're the only person who's ever made my daughter smile. She looked away. Come work for me, Elliot said. What? Be her caregiver, she trusts you. Clara laughed, a short, sharp sound. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you walked away from something you were meant to do. But it wasn't because you weren't good at it. For a moment she didn't speak. I can't, she whispered. Why not? I can't. He didn't press further, but he would find out. He had to. Clara hadn't meant to lie. But the truth was heavier than she knew how to carry, especially with a man like Elliot Reese watching her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. And he would. Because Elliot wasn't the kind of man who let go of questions. Not when they mattered. 3 days after their conversation in the back corridor, Clara found him sitting at the counter again. Same coat, same stillness, same eyes that didn't miss a thing. He didn't speak as she passed him coffee. She didn't ask why he was there, but she knew. And when the dinner rush faded and the air quieted, Elliot stood and said softly, let's talk. She didn't argue this time. Outside, the wind rolled in from the sea. The night air carried salt and silence. I know about Mason, Elliot said. Clara froze. He didn't stop. I know he was your brother. I know he had cerebral palsy. I know he passed away suddenly 2 years ago. Clara's breath caught. I know you were studying to help kids like him, that you were brilliant at it, that you walked away after he died. Stop, she whispered, but he didn't. Why didn't you tell me? Because it's not your story, Clara snapped, her voice cracking like dry glass. Elliot didn't move. You were meant to help children like Sophie, but you left. Why? Clara turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. Mason was everything to me, she said, voice low and raw. Our parents were absent. I raised him, I bathed him, fed him, learned every therapy before I had my driver's license. Her voice trembled. I promised him I'd always be there, that I'd help him get better, that he'd never be alone. She swallowed. But I couldn't fix it. One night it was just a fever, nothing big, but it got worse, and then too fast. By the time we got him to the hospital, it was too late. The words fell like rain. I was supposed to know what to do. I was the smart one, the one studying to save kids like him, but I failed him. Her hands shook. I haven't helped a child since. Elliot's heart twisted. Everything made sense now. Why she was in that diner. Why she flinched at his offer, why she had walls around her soul. She wasn't careless. She was wounded. He wanted to reach for her, say something, anything, but she was already backing away. So now you know, Clara said quietly. Happy? No, Elliot said, but I understand. And for the first time, Clara looked back at him and didn't see pity in his eyes. She saw respect. 1 week later, Elliot made the offer again. Just 1 week. Come to the house, try. Just try. Clara had every intention of refusing, but then she thought of Sophie. The way the girl had looked at her that night in the diner. The way her lips had curled into that fragile, miraculous smile. So she said yes, just 1 week. The Reese estate wasn't a house, it was a statement. Modern, cold, and vast. Iron gates, marble floors, echoing rooms. Clara followed Elliot through the entrance, the silence pressing on her like fog. This way, he said, leading her down a long hallway. They stopped at a door slightly ajar. Inside was Sophie's room. Pastel tones, shelves of untouched books, stuffed animals arranged like forgotten memories. A wide window spilled sunlight across the polished floor. Sophie sat in her wheelchair, small and still. She's been quieter than usual, Elliot murmured, since her mother passed. Clara didn't speak, she understood silence. The first 2 days were hard. Sophie flinched when Clara reached for her hand, turned away during story time, rejected food. Every small rejection echoed like a warning, this won't work, and Clara believed it. She sat by herself that night on the guest room bed, heart pounding, self-doubt clawing at her. What am I doing here? She whispered to the walls. What if I fail again? But on the third day, something changed. Clara was reading a picture book aloud, her voice steady but unsure if Sophie even listened. And then tap, 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 Sophie's fingers twitched in rhythm with the words. Clara froze. You like this story? She asked softly. No answer. But the tapping continued. That night, Clara sat beside Sophie's bed, adjusting the blanket. The little girl's eyes were half closed. Clara hesitated, and then she sang, You are my sunshine. My only sunshine. Her voice cracked by the second line. She hadn't sung that song since Mason had promised herself she never would again, but Sophie didn't stir. She stayed still, peaceful. Outside the door, Elliot stood frozen. He had come to check on them, to observe. But the moment he heard Clara's voice, something inside him collapsed. Sophie was asleep, truly asleep, no nightmares, no clenched fists. Elliot leaned against the doorframe. And for the first time since his wife's death, he let himself hope. The changes were slow. Sophie began responding, not always with words but with movement. Eye contact, a squeeze of the hand. Clara stayed. 1 week turned into 2. And Elliot began staying too. At first he watched from a distance. Then he joined in, helping Sophie build block towers, holding her hand during stretches, laughing, an unguarded sound that surprised even him. One afternoon, as Sophie worked with colored pegs, Clara noticed Elliot kneeling beside her, offering encouragement. Not orders, not instructions, just presence. You don't have to be here every time, Clara murmured. I do, he said quietly. Why? He didn't look at her. Because I should have been here a long time ago. Something shifted between them then. Clara, who had assumed Elliot was just another absentee father, now saw the truth. He wasn't absent because he didn't care. He was absent because he didn't know how not to be. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep without a single cry, they sat on the back patio. The sky was brushed with gold and lavender. Tea in hand, Clara stared at the horizon. She's improving, she said. Elliot nodded. Because of you. No, Clara said, because of herself. I'm just helping her see it. Elliot turned to her. You do that for everyone, he said quietly. Make them believe they can heal. Clara blinked. I used to. You still do. She looked away, heart pounding, and then his hand found hers. Light, testing. Clara. She looked up. And he kissed her, soft, careful, like he was offering something, not taking, and she kissed him back, just once, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be seen, but then she pulled away. I can't, she whispered. He reached for her again. I'm sorry, she said, backing up. This was a mistake. Why? Because I care, her voice broke, and I can't lose someone again. And just like that, she left him on the patio, alone with the echo of what almost was. Clara didn't look back when she left the Reese estate. She told herself it was for the best, that she was protecting Sophie, that she was protecting herself. But the lie felt like sand in her mouth. She had crossed a line, let herself hope, let herself feel, and that was the danger. She had promised herself she would never care again, not like this. So the next morning she walked into Elliot's study, heart hammering, hands trembling, and said the words she had rehearsed 100 times. I'm quitting. Elliot looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. Come again. She swallowed. I can't stay. His jaw tightened. Why? She wanted to tell him the truth. Because I care too much, because if I stay, I'll love her, I'll love you. And if I lose either of you, I'll break, but she couldn't say any of it. Instead, she shrugged like it meant nothing. It was always meant to be temporary. That's it, Elliot asked, voice tight. That's it. His eyes flashed. What about Sophie? Clara flinched. She'll be okay. No, he said, voice low and firm. She won't, and you know that. Clara bit her lip, tears threatening. You'll find someone else. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a voice cold enough to cut through her ribs, he said, That's what you think, that this was just about replacing her mother. She said nothing. You just think you do, he said quietly. Clara turned and walked away. Every step felt like a scream she couldn't voice. 3 days passed. Sophie stopped eating, stopped smiling, stopped reaching for the toys she once loved. Elliot tried. God, he tried. He sat with her at every meal. Read every story Clara had once read. Played the games they used to play, but nothing worked, because it wasn't just routine Sophie had lost, she had lost connection. And Elliot had lost something too, not just Clara. He had lost the part of himself that believed things could still get better. Sophie wouldn't look at him, wouldn't meet his eyes, and the house, once echoing with new hope, felt heavier than ever. One night, Elliot walked past Sophie's door and heard it. Soft crying, not loud, not panicked, just a quiet, desperate sound muffled into a pillow. He stepped inside. Sophie was curled into herself, trembling. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sophie," he whispered. She didn't move. "Talk to me, sweetheart." She sniffled, then so softly he almost missed it, she said, "Where's Clara?" Elliot closed his eyes. She had said so few words since the accident, and now the one name that broke through was the one he had let walk away. He pulled Sophie into his arms, his voice shaking. "I'm so sorry." Because he had failed her, not as a provider. As a father, the next morning he made a decision. He would go after her. This time he wouldn't ask, he would beg. Harbor and Hearth was busy when Elliot walked in, Sophie in his arms, her face pale, her body limp with sadness. But her eyes, those blue, searching eyes, held a flicker of something he hadn't seen in days. Hope. Clara was behind the counter, scribbling orders. Her hair was messier than before, her frame thinner, but her presence still radiant. She looked up and froze. Elliot didn't speak. He didn't need to. Clara rounded the counter before anyone else could react. She dropped to her knees before Sophie, her hands trembling. "Sophie," she whispered. The girl looked at her, blinking slowly, and then lifted a hand, touched Clara's cheek. Clara broke. Tears spilled down her face as she pulled Sophie into her arms. She held her like she was something sacred, something shattered and whole all at once. Elliot stood still, throat tight. And then finally he said the words he should have said weeks ago. "I need you." Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears. He took a step closer. "I don't just need you for Sophie, I need you for me." Her breath caught. "I was scared," he said, "of letting you in, of what it would mean." His voice shook. "But I can't do this without you." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out, because she wanted to believe him, but she was still afraid, still haunted by what she had lost. But then Sophie reached out. Her tiny hand clutched a spoon. Clara watched, stunned, as the girl lifted it to her lips. Shaky, slow, and ate by herself, one bite, but to them, it was everything. Clara's throat tightened. "You did it, sweetheart." Elliot let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "You really did." And then Sophie giggled, a sound Elliot hadn't heard since his wife's funeral. A sound Clara thought she would never earn again, and in that moment they weren't strangers, they weren't broken, they were becoming something new. Elliot reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara turned, still wiping away tears. "What?" He dropped to one knee. "Clara Monroe," he said softly, her hands flew to her mouth. "Marry me." "Gavin," she started. He held her hand. "I love you. I don't just want you in Sophie's life, I want you in mine." Clara's eyes filled again, but not with fear, with something else, something safe. She let out a breath and whispered, "Yes." He slid the ring on her finger and held her close. Sophie clapped beside them, unaware of the gravity of the moment, but radiating joy just the same. For the first time in years, they weren't running from something. They were walking toward it, together. The wedding wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. There were no golden arches or $1,000 centerpieces. No press, no headlines, just a sun-drenched garden, a few chairs, and people who mattered. Sophie sat in the front row in a soft lilac dress, her hair adorned with a tiny white flower. Her smile, rare and radiant, made the entire ceremony glow brighter than any chandelier. Clara stood in a dress she hadn't imagined herself wearing again. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with a quiet, overwhelming awe. Elliot stood across from her, no tailored speech, no grand declarations, just one sentence. "I choose you." Simple, certain. Clara didn't need more. "I choose you too." The early days of their marriage felt like a dream stitched together with morning laughter and soft bedtime lullabies. But dreams aren't perfect, and healing, true healing, isn't linear. Sophie had good days and quiet days. On some mornings she would giggle at breakfast, clumsily trying to stir her own cereal, proud of her progress. On others she would sit by the window in silence, eyes far away, unreachable. Clara learned not to fear the silence. Elliot, however, struggled more. He wasn't used to uncertainty, to gray areas. But Clara taught him that love wasn't a contract to manage. It was a presence to honor, a rhythm you learn to follow. One evening, as they were all watching an old animated movie, Sophie reached out unprompted and grabbed both their hands. Elliot looked at Clara. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That simple act, a child reaching, was everything they had hoped for. Time passed. Clara started working again, not full-time but part-time at a local child development center. At first she was hesitant, afraid the past would swallow her. But with each child she helped, with every parent she reassured, she found pieces of herself she thought she had lost. Elliot, too, changed. He scaled back. The empire he had once chased began to feel hollow. Numbers didn't matter as much as the way Sophie's eyes lit up when he read her favorite book for the 10th time. Clara once caught him asleep in a beanbag chair. Sophie curled up beside him, both of them snoring softly. And she cried, because that image, so ordinary, felt like a miracle. But not every chapter is smooth. One winter night, Sophie had a seizure. It had been over a year since her last one, and for a terrifying 30 seconds, everything unraveled. Clara held her, whispering through tears. Elliot called the ambulance with shaking hands. At the hospital, as machines beeped and nurses moved around them, Elliot collapsed into the hallway chair, head in his hands. Clara knelt in front of him. "She's strong," she said, her voice hoarse. "She's tired," he whispered. Clara squeezed his hand. "So are we, but we're not alone anymore." Sophie recovered slowly, and in the weeks that followed, something shifted. She began speaking again, not fluently, not often, but words came, one at a time, hesitant. Blue when choosing her sweater, happy when Clara sang, Daddy when Elliot kissed her forehead. It was messy, it was real. And it was more than they had dared hope. Spring came. The garden bloomed with quiet defiance. Sophie helped Clara plant lavender, her hands dirty, her face flushed with joy. "She's not just surviving," Elliot said, watching them from the porch. "She's learning to live." Clara looked back at him. "So are we." And they were, because the true miracle wasn't the ring on her finger or the house filled with laughter. It was the quiet resilience of a girl who refused to give up. And the two adults who chose every day not to run from love but toward it. One afternoon, Clara found Sophie drawing. A simple sketch, 3 stick figures, one tall. One curly-haired, one in a dress and wheelchair, above them the word home. Clara knelt down beside her, voice trembling. "Is that us?" Sophie nodded, then softly she said, "Family." Clara held her close. Because that word, spoken so clearly, was everything she had ever needed to hear. Years later, when people asked Clara how her life changed, she never mentioned the ring or the estate or even the quiet recognition that followed Elliot Reese's name. She always said the same thing: it started with a spoon. Not a miracle, not a rescue, just one small act of trust offered and accepted. Life didn't become perfect, but it became real. Sophie continued to grow in her own time, in her own way. She started school part-time at first, then full days. Clara would pack her lunch, slipping in notes with hand-drawn hearts and silly jokes. Elliot would wait by the door every afternoon, pacing nervously, pretending not to. Sophie came home with stories, not many, but enough to know she was beginning to build a world outside their own. One evening, Clara stood at the kitchen sink, watching Elliot in the backyard. He was chasing Sophie through bubbles from a toy machine. Her laughter rang out like sunlight. Elliot stumbled and fell into the grass with theatrical drama. Clara smiled. That was the man the world didn't see, the one who once built skyscrapers, now letting a 6-year-old rule his heart. She dried her hands, stepped outside, and joined them. Later, they sat on the porch steps, damp and grass-stained. Sophie curled beside them, half asleep. "I never thought I'd have this," Elliot said quietly. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me neither. But I'm glad we stopped running." Clara nodded. "Me too." Sophie's milestones came slowly, and everyone felt like its own universe. Her first full sentence came on a rainy day. They were driving to a therapy session, windshield wipers swaying like metronomes. Clara was humming softly in the passenger seat. Elliot drove, hands tight on the wheel. From the backseat came a small voice. "I love you." The car went silent. Elliot pulled over, tears flooding before he could speak. Clara turned around. "Sweetheart, say it again." Sophie smiled shyly. "I love you." 3 words, that stitched every broken piece inside them back together. Clara started writing again. Not essays, not research papers. Stories, children's books inspired by Sophie, by Mason, by the quiet battles no one saw and the victories no one celebrated. Publishers responded. One book turned into a series. The world began to know Clara Monroe not just as Elliot's wife, not just as the woman who helped Sophie thrive, but as a voice of comfort and courage for thousands of children and parents who felt unseen. Elliot watched it all unfold with quiet pride. His empire had once been made of glass. Now it was made of moments, of healing, of laughter, of home. On the anniversary of their wedding, Clara asked Sophie a question as they walked along the beach behind the house. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Sophie paused, thoughtful, then said, to help people find each other. Clara blinked. Why that one? Sophie looked at her mother with those same wide, knowing eyes. Because some people get lost. But if they find love, they come home. Clara's throat tightened. She looked out at the sea, then down at the small hand holding hers. And she knew Sophie wasn't just surviving, she was shining. Years later, Sophie stood on a stage. Not for a performance, not for applause, but to speak. She was 14, tall and poised, with her chair now an extension of her, not a limitation. The room was quiet, filled with children and parents, many of them living the life she once knew: silence, isolation, fear. Sophie leaned toward the microphone. My name is Sophie Reese. When I was little, I couldn't talk. I couldn't smile. I didn't know how to trust. But then someone, a stranger, knelt beside me and offered me soup. Laughter rippled through the room. She didn't call me broken. She didn't give up. Sophie's voice softened. She loved me before I knew how to love myself. Clara and Elliot sat in the front row, hands intertwined, hearts brimming. Sophie smiled. She's my mom now, not by birth, but by heart. A beat of silence. She chose me. Tears filled Clara's eyes. And my dad, he learned to love out loud. Sophie paused. And together they built me a home. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Sophie wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the two people who had taught her through every painful, precious moment that love is not measured in perfection. It's measured in presence. Back at home, the porch light glowed golden. The house was filled with books, laughter, shoes kicked off near the door, and scribbles on the refrigerator. Elliot sat with Clara on that same back patio where they had once almost lost everything. I still carry that spoon, he murmured. Clara smiled. I know. Why do you think that moment mattered so much? Clara turned to him, tears catching in her voice. Because it wasn't just a spoon, it was the first time someone reached into her world, and she let them in. Elliot nodded, eyes misting, and she never stopped. Families are not always made by blood. Sometimes they're built by kindness, by showing up, by staying. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Elliot had once believed he had everything, then he lost what mattered most. Clara had once believed she was meant to help until helping broke her heart. And Sophie, she had once lived in silence. Now her laughter filled rooms. Their story wasn't perfect. It was human, it was healing, it was home. And if you asked any one of them what love means, they'd say this: love is the choice to stay. To show up again tomorrow, to hold hands even when they shake, to whisper I'm here when the world feels too loud, to kneel with a spoon and say, you matter. Because sometimes the family we find is even more